An idea for a talk to the conference on privacy concerns for open data, and the organizers very correctly pointed out that that's a little negative, that I maybe ought to have the positive sides of open data. So Emily and Patrice, who are listed on here, are going to talk about that, and hopefully they're going to dispel all my fears. I'm now going to give you a ridiculously fast presentation on my fears. Okay, so my presentation is called Torturing Open Government Data, because I am indeed a torture master. Okay, I can tell you why in a little bit. First thing, disclaimers, I actually do like open data, I swear to God I do, and I just want to see it done right. And of course, these are all my own views, not my publishers or anything. These are very fast, too fast to even read, but we all know the reasons we love open data. It's transparency, you know, the taxpayers paid for it. It produces innovation so we can find, you know, where to take our kids to soccer and football most efficiently. All those applications that are coming out from the hackathons. Fear is a driver. You know, WikiLeaks is going to get the government's data anyway. We might as well open it up. I'd say one of the biggest drivers is cheapness. I know in New York City for years they had all of our transit apps are WizKid certified. And what that meant is we didn't write them, they're third party, so if the subway don't come, don't sue us. Right? So the basic idea, if you have somebody else mess with your data, you don't get sued or challenged or lose the next election. Notable examples, I won't go through all of them. In Canada, we have a whole club of cities, Vancouver, Edmonton, that are in this, the EU. India, I can't keep track. The last time I looked, they had over 4,000 databases, including one on who you paid a bribe to, which is interesting. And New York City data mines. So I want to start with them in October. I'm going to tell you 10 problems. So hopefully they have 10 answers. One of the problems, New York City released 103 data sets in October 2009. The next day there were 102 data sets. Why? Because they put out confidential information. People's private email addresses, people's secret questions. What was your first pet? Most common answer was Fluffy. Problem one, neglecting to have the brains to read the data before you put it out there. Moving rapidly to problem two, poor choice of data granularity. You need to know that in Canada we have alphanumeric postal codes. Santa Claus, for example, is ho ho ho, H0H0H0. This is the current data from Toronto's municipal complaint system, 311, and it's supposed to be coded by the first three characters of the postal code, which would be fine if they did that. But they're lazy, so they put in intersections, Military Trail, Old Kingston Road. That, of course, allows somebody to go and look up who made the complaint, figure out who the chronic complainants are, and so on. Any system that takes data from the public like this is at some risk. We have something in my city called C-Fix, and here's just a few examples of somebody who hates the car wash. So daytime excessive noise, ice accumulating. People go out there and just put in these complaints because people are, unfortunately, fundamentally nasty. Anybody ever seen Rotten Neighbor? It didn't last long, but it was a website where you could say anything terrible about any address. So for my own, I mean, vindictive lady and all that, for my own neighborhood, there it is, all rotten neighbors. Only one good neighbor, it happens to be the Calgary Flames. And you could call somebody a sex offender or whatever. This is gone, there was no way to make money from it, but there's still something called Dirty Phone Book where you can do this for any phone number. What does this tell us? People are going to go out there and post stuff. However, even one of my fellow professors posts stuff. He flew, good segue from the last session in here, a drone over my city and got everybody's heat score, how much energy they were wasting, and he plotted it. I said, do you not understand, Jeffrey, that this will be used by the police? They will go and look for grow-ups. He said, oh, I've never intended it to be used by the police. Yes, but it's up there. He said, oh, I have a privacy protection. You can have this information withhold and your house shows up blank. I said, idiot! That's like, there's the grow-up. Go for the damn grow-up. Okay, the Open Data Challenge in the EU, great contest, 434 entries. The winner, and it was brilliant, just aggregated government data from different ministries to see who was getting money from the Slovak government. So they were getting contracts and so on. And you would think this was public data, it should be out there. Well, sure enough, somebody named Ludmilla sued and had the application banned because she didn't want all the information out there. And in fact, the judge agreed with her. Why? Because judges tend to be 10 years behind the average person in understanding technology. And people didn't understand data can live in many places. So the reality is, These people didn't even have the data. They were just a pipe for the government's data, but the judge ordered them not to display the data, which is kind of weird. Did my wife vote for me? Let's say my wife was in the hospital, and in some election districts, there are people that get very few votes. So as an example, Dave Dowling, the third line down there, has 0 votes. In the whole city of Edmonton, the whole citywide hospital poll, occasionally when governments disclose small numbers, they can actually give information about individuals. So if I was a candidate and said, Carrie, did you vote for me? And she might say, yes, oh dear, I voted and I voted for you. Well, we're in trouble because obviously she didn't vote. Okay, campaign finance, great area for data mining. That was the state of the art when the United States legislation was written about campaign financing. It says when you give to a candidate, you must give your name, occupation, and address. It doesn't say what address, actually. So I went after the Philadelphia ones. First of all, they said these are not available for download. It took me a minute to download the entire file. First, I asked for all the contributors whose names began with A, and then B, and then C, and I think you see the pattern. So I had, after 26 tries, their entire database. They've now taken off the, but not available for download, maybe they heard. So controls on data downloading, where they say you can't download this or they try to make it hard, don't stop my students. They don't stop me. They don't stop people who have a reason to want the data. We're already up to problem number 7, which is I was able to find from those records some interesting stuff. There's a lot of talk here about RSA, and that is indeed Ron Rivest, a distinguished professor at MIT. Well, guess what? Ron gave a contribution of $200 to Friends of Stephanie Singer. Why is this weird? Ron lives in Massachusetts. She's a candidate in Pennsylvania. It's not illegal to give money to a candidate. It's just weird. Had I bothered to plot these zip codes on a map, he would have just jumped out. He jumped out because I know the guy, and I thought, well, that's odd that he did this.
I gave money to her too, actually.
Did you?
Yeah.
She must be a good candidate. All right, good. Go, Stephanie. Did she win?
She's a mathematician who believes in open data in Philadelphia.
That's a great piece. But the other thing you notice, 1719 Spring Garden Street. Somebody from there made a contribution. Well, even better, a lot of people made contributions. First of all, I went through to look at why we even needed addresses. So I took the 3 most common names in the U.S. and saw, would there be any confusion? Are there J. Smiths that might be ambiguous? For those names, I got very, very few duplicates. Conclusion, having the address didn't do a lot of good in resolving duplication, but it may have compromised privacy. But then I came up with this Spring Garden Street. Look how many people, Smiths, Johnsons, and so on, live there. It must be the world's largest rooming house. It's not. It's the headquarters of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. So you can maybe imagine what's going on. Somebody goes in to get a job, and there's a sheet there to make contributions, and there's some kind of encouragement. You can imagine what the encouragement might be. So sure enough, you can infer things from government data like this, and that got to be interesting. A couple of problems here. The inconsistency. You have to give an address. It has to be a place where you can get your contribution receipt. Nowhere, as far as I know, does the law say what address it can be. It could be the massage parlor you frequent, or it could be your union office. And the policy issue, why do we even require an address? It kind of was written in the law in the 1980s, but things have changed. We don't use the Commodore PET as a computer. We have big data, we have facial recognition, putting together databases. So a few more things: don't get arrested anywhere, but don't get arrested in Florida. Sheriffs are elected. They put you up online when you are elected. There's your mugshot. Public data, arguably. Well, I caught this sheriff putting up the data of a 12-year-old kid. And it's not legal, by the way, to do that. But the whole question of what is public information needs to be viewed differently. In particular, we have industries like mugshots.com. They insist that they are a public-spirited, patriotic site that wants to show you who's a criminal. In the corner, you'll find that for $499, you can have your mugshot taken down. So they're not that public-spirited. They have their price. The newest vulnerability is your face. This is a piece of technology that I can hold up my Android phone, recognize your face, and look it up in the database. Currently, the only base is the National Registry of Sex Offenders. So if you go into a bar, if you're about to talk to a sex offender. If and when they get the Facebook facial database, things will get very different. Okay, a few more things. Pistol permits, again, public record, but look, I found this guy in the Bronx, Middletown Road in the Bronx, a few blocks from where I used to live. He's an outlier because he actually works in Rockland County or Westchester, but his address is there. But then I went after him with some tools, Spokio, Multigo. I didn't spend a penny in terms of tracking him for money, but I got his middle initial, his approximate age, the value of the property he's defending with the gun, the fact that he has a post office box, and so on. The point of this slide is once I have one thing on somebody, there's a lot more out there. Just in closing, future vulnerabilities, your DNA. We now know that I've left enough DNA on this glass now that I could be genetically sequenced. It's called touch DNA. We've already had people who have been adopted using DNA to find their surname or find, in some cases, their sperm donor father. We have a mobile DNA testing truck now that goes around New York City offering on-the-spot testing. So it's definitely come down to the consumer. And my closing point, we have to worry about the future. We have to worry about time-traveling robots from the future, because if things happened 10 years ago, it might be online. 5 years ago, probably. Now it's almost certainly online. That data that used to be in the dusty basement of the courtroom now is totally available, totally searchable, and linkable to others. So I love this real ad, free to a good home, beautiful kitten or handsome 32-year-old husband, good job, doesn't like cats. Says he goes where the cat goes, call Jennifer, come and see both and decide what you like. Why do I show you this? To remind us that we have to make choices. We have to make decisions, and we will be making decisions. Okay, so that's me. That's my book that I've been hawking here and promoting to you guys. And it's time for Emily. Thank you very much. I think I made it in 10 minutes, actually. Challenge you guys to do the same. The reason we said 10 minutes each is so we have time to have a good discussion.
Well, I think I'm going to unfortunately be disappointing you and not providing an entirely separate side of the coin. I think we're going to have a lot of overlap in terms of our themes. Oh, I didn't add my information to this. Where's your play?
Just go slideshow view, I guess.
Okay, yeah.
See what happens.
So my name is Emily Shaw, and I am the National Policy Manager at the Sunlight Foundation. We do typically simply speak well about open data, but because of the nature of the conversation, I thought we have an opportunity to talk about some of the specific aspects of state and local government data holding that is maybe different from a lot of the federal level conversation that I think we typically have, especially this close to Washington, D.C. And having just, I don't know how many people are in the presentation before this in this room. So we are primed to think about, oh, excellent, I'm glad that you're here. We're primed to think about the nature of local data holdings, particularly, thinking about the nature of information that might be held at the local level that isn't necessarily, that may be very detailed and important, that's not held at the federal level. My background is in state government, and so I tend to focus on what kinds of data holdings exist at the state level. And particularly what types of individual level records are held at the state level. And so this is just kind of the list that came off the top of my head of individual level records that we would expect to be held at the state level. Much of it is information that we would understand to be privately, personally identifiable. And some of it has firm legal protection, some of it is public. Some of it depends on what state you're in, whether it's private or public. But really, it's a fairly substantial number of data points that we would expect a state government to be holding about you. What's also really important to know about the state level and the local level as well is that the kind of protection that those individual level data points has varies amazingly. This is both the beautiful and slightly horrifying thing about state government, that there's just a tremendous amount of variation in terms of what a state interprets as personal, as public, and we're going to be seeing a lot of variation depending on what area of data you're interested in. So to some degree, there's a certain acceptance of privacy is private, and state law incorporates the basic kinds of privacy laws that are afforded at the federal level. Some states become much more protective. Some states are rather minimalist when it comes to understanding privacy rules around individual level data points. The voter registration databases, I think, is a really good example because I was surprised at the level of openness there is in some states around this. So voter registration is to some degree going to be public in all states because it is understood to be there's a valuable role for the public in overseeing the proper and legitimate holding of this information, to be sure that there's no fraud, to be sure that people are accurately registering themselves. So to some degree, this is going to be open data in the sense that we are going to have access to it. However, this ranges from Florida's version of openness, which is your name, your date of birth, your address, your party ID, not just open, but open, available in bulk. And they acknowledge on the Florida kind of on their FAQ site that this information may be held and publicized by third parties, and you may have to pay a fee for them to remove it. And this is kind of Florida's official acknowledgement of the degree of their openness. Iowa is kind of a middle case, I found, where it is publicly available online. It is available in person at a commissioner's office, but they acknowledge that people may collect larger amounts of it. However, they identify that it's a misdemeanor for people to use it for commercial purposes. So in Iowa, for instance, you cannot be required to pay $199 to have your name removed from the page. In California, they go a little bit further in the sense that they are going to audit what use that information is being put to. So they have a particular set of uses that you can say, I want to use this voter registration information for a scholarly purpose or for a journalistic purpose, and they will determine whether or not that's an acceptable use before releasing that information. So it's, furthermore, they prescribe it from being used online. They say it shall not appear on a computer terminal. So, this is I thought, a really healthy range of what openness means in the context of voter registration. It's similar for campaign finance. Campaign finance sometimes discloses your address and your name and everything alongside very small, even campaign donations. Other states, much less so. There's variation also at the state level in terms of when protected information can be released. And this is true broadly speaking too. So even where there are categories of information that are more protected, like medical information or school information protected under HIPAA and FERPA, it has always been the case that it can be used for reasons that are consonant with the program. So for extending medical treatment, your data can be used for achieving an evaluation of a particular school program. Your data can be used possibly without your immediate knowledge or consent because it's achieving the same goal as the rest of the program for which you had allowed that information to be used. There's a huge and growing gray area, however, in the third-party realm, because HIPAA, for instance, covers a certain number of health facilities, but it doesn't cover your Fitbit. FERPA covers what happens within a school, but it doesn't necessarily cover the first in math program my son uses, right? I mean, because those third-party data holders are not covered by the same kind of requirements that our public entities are covered under. And as the number of those entities grows, then we have less and less control that we feel like we falsely believe we have under these state laws. There's also this question of how open data and how the use of additional big data data sets allows us to create new PII, new personally identifiable information. So the goal with releasing information openly is that it should not have identifiable information in it, so that it should be de-identified, anonymized, or aggregated so that we don't have individuals identifiable within it. But when you get different data sets put together, then you have the possibility of re-identifying people through the additional information you create in linked data sets. Integrated data sets are a very important area for instance, identifying the value of social service interventions. So, where you want to know, is this new education technique helping to reduce the number of high school dropouts or people, or is this new kind of after-school program resulting in better employment? You have to start creating integrated data sets that link workforce data sets with criminal justice data sets, with education data sets, and these are useful from the perspective of evaluating program value, but it also re-identifies individuals very frequently because of the increased number of data fields. At the moment, most of these data sets are kind of walled off in the sense that you need to be credentialed to use them. But I think there's a concern that as this becomes normalized, then you have another area where people can be identified through the use of, at one point, anonymized data. And then there's the question of how we understand geolocation, wireless signal, and even things like cars that can be identified through automatic license plate readers to be elements of our PII as well, right? So this is, that didn't resolve very well. This is a man wearing a monkey mask.
Oh, okay. Sorry to see that.
This is from several years ago. Automatic license plate reading identified him as having sped 37 times, this monkey in this car. And so, the question were those tickets, could he be compelled to pay them? Since he was the registered owner of the car. And he said, well, you have identified the car, you have not identified me. There is a monkey driving this car, I don't know. So, there is a question about his car was in public, but because this was being passed through this different form of identification, does that still apply to him? I think, he may have been the only person to get out of this, but, otherwise that's a big question. The commercial use of phone tracking, causes us to wonder, how much are our wireless signals, which have kind of entered this space of being unprotected, something that we can lay claim to as elements of our personal identity. And in general, there's a lot of space out there that is currently being kind of understood to be unprotected because it hasn't yet been protected. So our wireless signal is understood to be unprotected. We don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy around it. That's become the default place where that's it, where it is. Another area that's contestable from the perspective of understanding how privacy is protected within government data sets is understanding the role of consent. This is obviously generally an issue for people concerned with privacy. It has been for a long time, but we can understand it to have a new dimension given the increased use of data and the increased accessibility of data. So, while consent may have always been an issue with regard to certain kinds of government data collection, it becomes more important when more people are using that data. So some of the things that we might think about in connection with that concern, the lack of opportunity to withhold consent or feared retaliation if you withhold consent. Many categories of public assistance require, a basically reduced expectation of privacy in order to participate in those kinds of programs. And so that's a big area of concern. I mean, if I have a state that requires me to regularly submit to drug tests in order to receive, certain kinds of housing or food benefits, the access I have over my drug test results, may be much more limited, and that's an area of concern when other people may be able to access that and link that to other things. And then, all of us face this problem of the lack of opportunity to know what our data is being used for. And that's something that cuts across and may have to do with the speed at which these things are being repurposed as much as anything else. On the other hand, this is not all bad. There are many opportunities within many opportunities within the state and local data space that make it a more exciting and dynamic place to work, I think, than the federal level. We have additional privacy laws that are being passed at the state level that could never get past the federal government, requiring warrants for email access, requiring warrants for using cell phone tracking. A number of these things are kind of moving ahead in states that are more concerned with privacy, that are providing, kind of leadership opportunities that other states can look to. There's things that are happening in connection with education data, particularly, that suggest that there's going to be opportunities for states to start regulating some of the third-party data space in connection with education specifically. A big data collection effort called In Bloom was intended to include student demographic data, pretty detailed student demographic data, along with different kinds of uses of online testing. And then, this was compiled across many states. It was done without parent permission. It was just kind of part of the Common Core rollout. And parent groups essentially were behind the eventual dismantlement of the system, because so many of them protested to their state legislatures that they didn't want to see this happening. So, there's certainly a lot more opportunity for things to move in terms of allowing people to speak up about whether they want their data used for certain kinds of purposes or not. Similarly, the 38 state suit against Google for illegitimately collecting private data, unsecured wireless data, was a really important step in announcing, states will protect their citizens' privacy. There's a role that they can play in the judicial field. On the other hand, it's not always successful, and states also sometimes become regressive. In Minnesota, a recent case determined that driver database lookups, even though they were seemed to target ex-partners of police officers or various other kinds of, there was a preponderance of women who are targeted for hundreds of driving records lookups. There was one successful case where a fairly large settlement was achieved, and then a series of additional cases were thrown out by a federal judge who determined that it would just be too expensive for Minnesota to comply with these sorts of requests. And essentially, once you have turned over your personal information for a regulatory purpose, you no longer have the same claim to be able to restrict its use. So sometimes yes, sometimes no, but that's the nature of the states. You win some, you lose some, but what's exciting is you get to watch how it gets developed across a number of different jurisdictions at the same time. All right, thank you.
So much. Could we lights up for?
Yeah.
Those thoughts?
Are you done?
Yes.
Okay.
You're on.
I'm on. Okay. Well, I'm used to being a talking head, so I'm a serious policy wonk. So I'm going to raise more questions than make a presentation. So how many of you have read the report that Podesta's group did? One. Okay. Two. How many of you have read the PCAST, the President's, what are they, the Council on, President's Advisory Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. Actually a really great group. And they raised some policy issues, a lot of technology issues. But, so I recommend both of those to you for thinking about big data and what it means when the government has it. And that's, my group is openthegovernment.org. We're a coalition of close to 100 now organizations that work to make government more open and to push back on secrecy. And we have always thought that privacy is the inverse, it's the flip side of access. That if you don't have the ability to protect the information, to be sure that the information you give government is going to be protected, then it limits people's willingness to give information to government. And it's easy now to make fun of folks in the 70s and 80s when they wrote the Privacy Act and when, the old style technology. But actually a lot of the issues that we're trying to deal with now were things that were addressed in the Privacy Act of 1974, 76. They're, what does it mean when the government collects your personally identifiable information? What are they allowed to do with it? How do you know that they have it? And especially, if you've been required to give it to get a benefit, but you don't always know, especially now, if they have it. If you have reason to believe, or if you find out they have it and you want to fix what it's in it, that it's incorrect. How do you do that? If they want to share it with another agency, do they have to tell you? Do you have to consent to that? What's the process for that? What are the circumstances in which it can be shared with other agencies without it being applied to you? What agencies are covered by the Privacy Act? It's not all of them. So these are things that are actually key components of the law that theoretically we are still operating under now, but practically it doesn't mean a whole lot because of the way that data is collected and used. And for me, it's a major area of concern. So the Privacy Act requires that in order to prevent secret databases, agencies have to publish the details of all their systems of records in the Federal Register. System of record, unfortunately, means a system of records that are searchable by name or a numerical identifier of some sort. Well, that doesn't work anymore, obviously. It requires agencies maintaining these systems of records to give individuals access, to have a right to fix them, to have an appeal if they're not being met with. Privacy Act also limits the government's availability to share and to disclose information placed in a system of records. Disclosure has to be made, they have to give you notice and you have to consent except under 12 circumstances, and those include disclosures to someone who has adequately notified the agency that the record is to be used for statistical research or reporting, and it is transferred without individually identifying data. That it's disclosure to an agency of a governmental jurisdiction within or under the control for civil or criminal law enforcement activity. And it has to be shared with a written request of the agency. The disclosures made where there are compelling circumstances affecting someone's health or safety, and the person whose health or safety is affected is sent a notification of the disclosure. Agencies are required to only keep the minimum amount of information, relevant information necessary. It prohibits agencies from running matching programs. The essence of data integration, the essence of data fusion now, I think, is matching programs where you bring the data together and see what comes out. The Privacy Act says there has to be a written agreement among the agencies. It has to be given to, well, the names of these have changed, but House and Senate committees. It can only last 18 months, or it can be renewed. The matching agreement must state the purpose and legal authority, the justification, its anticipated results, procedures for giving notice to potentially affected individuals, verifying the accuracy of the program's results, keeping records current and secure, regulating the use of results. And every agency under the law that does a matching program is required to have a data integrity board. And the authority of the Data Integrity Board also extends to agency matching activities, not just matching programs. So these are really critical protections that seem to have just gone by the wayside. And we really have very little to replace it. We know now that, as Emily talked, and this has been a problem, it's not just, in the last few years with big data, but that agencies are commonly sharing information among themselves. That routine use has become one of the most abused things, which that allows agencies to share information without giving notice to the person it's about. They're running matching programs without written agreement. They're not they don't have data integrity boards. They're not notifying anybody. And more, they're drawing in information from third parties, from the private sector. Those of us that were around, and I look sort of like most of us in the room would have been when the Total Information Awareness Program was proposed, which is still happening as far as any of us can tell. It's just broken up under different names. A lot of us were concerned about the government going out and pinging these private databases. Well, we know now that they are doing that. And there's no limitations on that. There's nothing in place that, then our argument was, well, if the government doesn't hold on to the data, doesn't store it in some sort of system of records, does that make it not so bad because it's not entering into the work of agencies? But we have very strong reason to believe now that government is doing that they are bringing that information in, that it is being fused with other information. It's being integrated, but more so, and again, I recommend the PCAST report to you, it's being fused with data in ways that make it impossible, even if we call that a system of records, impossible to pull all of the information that the government has about an individual, to pull it up by any sort of identifier. But because of the nature of the information, it can also be de-anonymized and re-identified. So we're in this double bind situation. So I would throw out to folks in this room, where do we go? I mean, the only law that we've heard talked about in recent months, recent years, is ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, which has to do with stored communications, your email, your phone. And that's important, and that needs to be addressed. But that's not the entire universe of the data that the government is collecting. And information that the government collects in one setting can be shifted to be shared in other settings. FERPA data maybe can't now, but with other sorts of arrangements, all sorts of data that is given to the government, generated by the government, pulled in by the government, can be shared to create these fused information databases. So what do we need? What are the policies that we need to be identifying? I don't think that we want to rely on the goodwill of the agencies. We certainly don't want to rely on the goodwill of NSA to the information that it is taking in and that it's allowed to store for 5 years. We know, we've been told by the PCLOB, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, that what they're doing with a lot of that data is pulling it into another database that they call the corporate store. We know that other government agencies have been asking for this information. We know that some of it's being shared. What we don't know is what happens when it goes out into these other agencies, what their rules are, what their minimization standards are, whether any kind of law is being applied. So I would open it up to ask you, what do you think are the key provisions that we should be addressing, that we should ask Congress to, assuming that Congress ever acted on anything, to think about, to begin to address this new data world that we're in. There are enormous interesting uses and benefits of big data, but there are enormous risks, and it's we have to figure out what that tension is. Somebody at another thing said they were told not to talk about balance anymore, and it's not a balance, it's a dynamic tension. So I would like to ask folks in the audience, what do you think are the key values that should be regulating how government uses the information that it gets from us, that it gets about us from third parties, that it requires us to give for something and then shares?
Let me throw a specific out of you, because I researched the Canadian case for this book.
Right.
And we had riots after the Stanley Cup finals in Vancouver a few years ago. It was a very interesting problem because there are amazing photographs. In fact, there's a photograph, and I have the link in the book, where you can zoom in. Andrew, this will interest you. You can zoom in on this thing, and you can see the whole crowd. It's like 5,000, 10,000 people. You can zoom into one face. And the way they did that picture was with 64 different high-res cameras and all that. It was a demonstration. But I mean, the technology will come soon. You know what I'm talking about, probably. Where you'll be able, very high resolution, where you can be very far away and you can zoom in.
But not with our type of systems.
Not with
You
it.
either have a choice of high res or wide.
Right, well, this is Seattle company, it's in my book, and the Seattle company that has this up on their website. But here was the problem that they have. The BC government runs the car insurance business, they're a monopoly business, so they had all kind of information on people. Here the police have these surveillance photographs, are they allowed to bring them together?
Right.
So they took it to the privacy commissioner, and she's very bright, she said, well, here's the way it works. You can go up and do this match kind of in escrow, but then if you see a probable match, a judge has to approve the releasing of the data. Now, I mean, that was a few thousand matches. It doesn't work for
Right.
what the NSA wants to do. But is there any kind of escrow model there that you think has any potential?
I don't know. I mean, that's a possibility. Another, I think, part of what the PCAST points out is that in that example, you could identify it down to an individual.
Yes.
And it's
And some
thousands.
were 14 years old then.
Right,
too.
right. I think what the PCAST was particularly looking at is where data is brought together, not just two databases, but fused from any number of places. And can you then, if an individual wanted to know, as they can under the Privacy Act, if they wanted to ask for all the information that the government has about them, PCAST argues that's increasingly impossible because you can't pull it out. Although in these cases, you could probably, from statistical data, re-identify an individual. One of the things that PCAST talks about is audit trails and tagging and that sort of thing, but that doesn't get to the notice and consent. That doesn't get to the people being allowed to know what the government has about them. Yeah.
So I was just going to say that the idea of holding data in escrow and matching it up is in fact exactly what the NSA
Right.
has been doing or wanting to do through PRISM, etc. Is store the data on the company's server and then be able to locate it after the fact. So that's what the NSA claims it's doing. Or we have
So they have pretend judges moving on.
But I have a different idea. It's just an idea and an approach. The rules regarding data protection are much higher in Europe.
Yes.
Now, so it's not possible or it's illegal for the governments to match data from two different databases
Right.
together. Right? Now, that's in theory. In practice, that's not necessarily true. Having said that, and given also the fact that Google recently lost a case in European
Right.
courts where users wanted to be able to
Be forgotten.
Be forgotten. Okay.
Yeah.
So now, I live in the United States, but I'm a European citizen. And in a previous panel, I asked if it was possible to invoke, and not that I'm worried
Right.
about something, but theoretically, would it be possible for me to invoke my rights as a European citizen and ask European courts to act on my behalf to prohibit US government agencies from putting that data together? And the answer from this German academic was yes.
Yeah?
In actual practice, no.
Yeah, okay.
So I'm
Right.
playing somewhere with this. So
Yeah.
legally, she said, the European courts, just as in the case of the Google
Right.
right to be forgotten, in theory, the European courts should protect me from anybody violating my rights because I'm a European citizen.
Right.
Now, there are many European citizens that visit the United States to go to Disneyland, to go
Right.
to the Grand Canyon, many of us who live here.
Right.
So we could easily bring a class action in European courts and
Right.
say, you need to fight for our rights. Now, this is very theoretical, but in practice, given that Google has been able to lose this case,
Right.
which I'm not necessarily in support of the European court's
Right.
ruling in this case, it seems theoretically possible to force the U.S. government to discuss these issues in a way that it wouldn't do inside the U.S. Because inside the U.S. people said, we're not going to deal with this.
Right.
Right.
We
On
don't
the
have
other
to,
hand,
we're not going to.
If a European court, if they can bring Google to the table, which is
Right.
a very large entity, why couldn't they theoretically be forced to create an international standard by going after the U.S. government, maybe not the NSA, but just for matching data on any European citizen who seems to be possible. So an unusual kind of approach.
I'm not a,
Not a lawyer.
I'm not a lawyer, right? Are you a lawyer?
I'm not, but I
Yeah.
have a response to an earlier
Yeah.
comment you were making, which is
But that's,
something that
it's interesting.
we're advocating within our team to state and local governments, which is that they create data inventories.
Yes,
And
right.
that's, I think, an important piece of the puzzle.
Right.
We need to know what is being held in order
Right.
to be able to make a claim about it.
Right.
And that's something that we're going to become more aggressive about requiring in order for, because the idea is open data is a very appealing thing for a
Right.
variety of reasons, and people are asking for their states
Right.
and cities to open up. But, part of that needs to be in a growing,
Right.
knowledge of what is being
Right.
held. Even things that can't be released because they haven't been adequately redacted because they contain too much sensitive information.
Right.
So we
right.
ask for that.
So it's at the state level, so at the federal level, when they collect information about individuals, and they're also now required when they're creating new systems to do privacy, personally identifiable, or privacy impact assessments. So I'm not sure that every agency is, I think they're mostly according with that. But at the federal level, when they create these databases of individuals' information, they do it in a system of records. I don't know if they call it, if it has a separate name, and I don't know enough about the federal level to know. Yeah, it's a terrible mess, and you can't track what they're doing with it because the notices in the Federal Register are incomprehensible. But no, our government is also requiring, I'm sorry, I'm jumping all around, data inventories. And agencies are complying slowly with them. I don't know if it will include systems of records, is what, I don't know. And if it doesn't tell you much. It might tell you they have records about you in a HUD database or in an AG database, or that there's personally identifiable information in there, but whether those are, I don't know. That's the
Well, I mean, it's happening in the health data area
Right.
kind of most visibly with the idea of the blue button and
Right.
being able to
Right.
access all of your health
Right.
records
Right.
through that. And
Right.
the green button, all
Right.
of your energy records.
Right.
So
right.
I'm now pushing for the green button, all of your bureaucracy.
There you go. Yeah.
I don't want to dominate.
I don't.
I was just going to say the federal government actually is not able to track its own contractors.
Right.
Even within a single agency.
Right.
Department of Agriculture famously had 34 different email systems just within the Department of
Right.
Agriculture, which I think they integrated maybe 5 years ago.
Right.
Maybe less than that. So, and one thing they've been struggling with is just to be able to compare contractor records across agencies to see,
Right.
for purposes of efficiency. There's a new system called SAM.
Right.
I think it's the
Systems acquisition management.
system,
Yeah.
where they're trying to integrate stuff. So, just to demonstrate the incompetence of the government in tracking the people that they pay to do stuff. Forget about us.
Right.
But they are looking into that. And
Right.
part of the problem is the legacy database
Right.
systems they have.
Right.
But I think what you're saying is right. It's important to figure out ways to tag data.
Yeah.
And to be able to maybe move towards, at least towards the future, right? And so those systems need to be built. And I think certainly if we can learn from some of the models they're trying to implement in the contractor management,
Right.
we might be able to see ways to, actually it's not because their systems are good, because their systems
Right.
are bad, but they had hopefully have figured out what went wrong or what the flaws are in the previous systems which we could learn
Right.
from.
Right.
So that would be an interesting area
Yeah.
to look into. I think.
Yeah. Yeah. But one thing I would ask is, in this SAM, is there a way for contractors to know that well, obviously if they're getting paid, they know, but do they have an opportunity to go in and correct information?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
Sam, you register for it.
Right, right,
So
right.
there were multiple systems you had to register for.
Right.
What was the system before that? You
It
had
doesn't-
to
yeah.
register for
About
that.
8 of them.
Yeah, and they've
Certified stuff.
they fused them.
And there were
Well,
many
monitor the
others.
same web over.
Right.
So the
Right.
systems you could register for, and the systems that they registered for you for incident
Right.
internally, this was only partly to be able to
No,
integrate both the systems.
Does that, doing pilot stuff like that and exploring how that allows, if it allows, in this case, it sounds like it does for notice and, consent. It's implied consent, I guess, if you
If you don't do it, you don't
get paid, yeah. But most of the information in the Privacy Act assumed that you were sharing this information with the government for a benefit, and that it wasn't entirely a voluntary sort of thing. I think the bigger problem, and that could be a really useful pilot. I think the bigger problem is the information that's being pulled in about us that we don't even know about, and being used across government. And that might be a paranoid fantasy.
The real thing I'd worry about is the data sets getting out and getting sucked into the Nexus Lexus type stuff.
Yeah.
Where they suck in everything from everywhere.
Right.
And their job is to make it in a usable format so you can go buy it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they're pulling in every court record from every
Yes.
community and
Yes.
everything in there.
Right.
They send high school kids into court basements with notebooks because you're not allowed to photograph or photocopy, so they just write the stuff. Just a closing thing on that, there were 2 cases that we did. One had to do with a person who could never get a job. He always got the job interviews, an engineer, and finally, Choice Point wouldn't give him his file, his public information file.
Right.
They only released a headhunter. So he got a headhunter to get his file, and what did he find? The headhunter said, of course you never get a job, you're a murderer. You did 12 years of murder. He said, that's not me, and they had scrambled it up with his
Right,
name. But a
right.
much more interesting one is a woman who said, it's on my file that I was in small claims court in the state. So I went to them, I said, I sued the bastard and I won. Put that in there, I was the plaintiff. And they said, no.
Oh,
Is it
wow.
a fact that you were there on that? Yes, oh, then your file's correct.
Oh, wow.
So there's
Yeah.
a real issue
Yeah.
with that.
This is
Accuracy
the right to
and-
be forgotten.
Yeah.
Well, and the accuracy of the data and the right to correct it and, before we close down,
Yeah, and what about, remember Hurricane Katrina,
Mhm.
where the health and,
Yes.
And a lot of data was suddenly released?
Yeah. Well, it was
But
floating
not only-
away, yeah.
But not only that, there were women who had restraining orders
Right.
against their husbands.
Right,
And these people suddenly were able to track them down.
Right.
Through such, and I mean, you can't redact that at that moment.
no, not at that moment, and this
So
is
there's
actually,
places
Yeah.
that, there's checks and balances.
Yes.
About what data is actually and where it's all going.
yes,
Like,
exactly, yeah.
Since Pratap brought up the question about contractors, maybe we can phrase, is there an American equivalent of that European winner? The one that took all the different companies that got government money and cross-referenced their lawyers, their boards of directors, and if not, why don't one of your organizations do it?
There are a lot of cities that
Right.
open data up, and so
Right.
I don't know that there's a national one.
That's why
but
this is an
happens all
app
the
that
time.
just aggregated and found that you were on the board of this company that got this contract and the lawyer for that company, and just listed the names, and that's why she sued. Lynn sued because her name was too prominent in getting stuff
And there
out.
are efforts going on to sort of track those things. It's actually really complicated at more than a sort of surface level because what's called beneficial ownership,
Mhm.
who actually it's the parent company of all these subsidiaries and children, and how you can track that and how you track their name across all these different versions of it, and then how do you know that X person on this board is the same as X person on that, so.
You need a smart
This is one of the big
20-year-old.
Yeah,
problems with
right.
SAM also, is that if you have a business and if you lose
Yeah.
your contract,
Right.
you lose your contract because you've committed fraud,
Right.
you create another DUNS number and get the contract number name. So SAM is intended to try and address the fact
That's
that
right.
companies, individuals can have
Right.
multiple identities
Yes.
and deliberately choose to do that
Yes.
to fool the government
Right.
system because they know the government system doesn't work.
Right.
And SAM was trying to address
That's
some of
that.
that to a certain extent.
Right.
You
I
can go on
think
the
he-
internet and find the whole network of each company and all the connections and everything else. And that's not government. right?
No,
So
no,
they're
no,
using
this is a
government records,
nonprofit that's trying
but
to,
they're
actually
using-
several.
But they're using government records
Right.
to publicize.
Right,
that
right,
information.
right.
Well done, panel, thank you so much.
Thank you.